I'm Nick Knudsen, joined by Will Miles. Welcome to Stand Up and Holler. On tonight's episode, we will talk about Florida's devastating loss to Vanderbilt. We'll go over the SEC quarterback YAR rankings here at nearing the end of the season, so we want to check in on that. We'll preview Friday's FSU game and wrap up with Florida's bowl projections, along with some playoff talk. Will, let's just jump in, take our medicine here. Florida loses to Vanderbilt. The Gators lose control of this one in really a three-possession sequence just before and after the half. Down 7-6, Jason Marshall standing in for Henderson as the punt returner drifted back toward the goal line to field a punt, but he muffed it, goes into the end zone where the Vandy long snapper recovers it to give the Commodores a 14-6 lead before the half. The second big error here, Richardson, the offense, delivered on a key drive to open the second half, cutting the lead to 14-12 for Vanderbilt. Florida had Vandy stopped on a 3rd and 14 when Amari Burney was flagged for defensive holding, and Vanderbilt went on to melt 7 minutes off the clock and scored a touchdown to go up 21-12. Okay. On the following offensive possession, Richardson was under pressure on 3rd down and tried to flip it out to Bowman. The ball took a freakish bounce upward and ended up in the hands of a Commodore defender to set Vanderbilt up in prime field position at the UF 28. Wright throws a TD on the next play, and Vanderbilt is all of a sudden up 28-12 with 2:06 left in the third quarter. 3 touchdowns served up on a silver platter here. Well, this team is good enough to put on a performance like they did last week against South Carolina. So they're capable of something, right? On the high end, Will. You've talked about the variance. You've talked about closing that wave, right? All season long. Well, we got rock bottom here on Saturday because 2 things we definitely know about this team. The 2022 Gators are not good enough to overlook an opponent, which we should have learned after USF. And the 2022 Gators are not good enough to gift an opponent 3 touchdowns. I don't know many teams that are. Florida got away from its recent formula of success in this one, Will, but you can't. So you could talk about the run game. You could talk about maybe some of the game plan, but the fact that you gifted 3 touchdowns away in this game, that above all is why Florida lost to Vanderbilt for the first time on the road since 1988.
Yeah, well, I mean, you knew coming out to start with, they get the bad snap for the 18-yard loss. Even that, Richardson's able to complete a ball to Pearsall where he runs down the sideline, gets the first down. That end around to Pearsall looked like he was wide open to run for a touchdown. The turf monster gets him. Then they get down into the red zone after he hits a big shot to Reynolds, and then they get down to the red zone. He's got a 3rd down blitz, perfect call, man-to-man for Vanderbilt, which means that Montrell Johnson's wide open in the flat. Ball just pops right off of Johnson's hands. One of many, many drops on the day. Actually, Richardson was more accurate than his line is going to indicate based on all the drops in this one. But right there, you handed Vanderbilt 4 points when you had to settle for a field goal, essentially, instead of, and they could have still gotten a first down on that one. So even if you don't think Johnson was going to get in the end zone, he was going to get close. You have the illegal formation on the 27-yard run by Montrell Johnson down to the 4. Florida probably punches that one in instead of ending up with a field goal on that one. You got the missed extra point. You got holding on kickoffs when Vanderbilt was offsides. You've got, the interception you mentioned, the touchdown to Bresnahan that was on that first play after the interception. The tackling on that was just atrocious. You got the targeting on Ventrell Miller. You got Shorter catching the ball with 2 seconds left on the outside. They should have run out the clock. I have no idea what the officials were doing. Apparently,
just a flat out miscall.
Yeah, well, I'm sitting there going, apparently these guys don't like the 11 a.m. start in the cold in Nashville either, because they're like, damn it. And then Florida gets a gift and Richardson throws the ball out of the end zone. So, yeah. From start to finish, it was just, hey, look, there's my foot. Bam. Like that was the entire game. And, like you said, Florida isn't good enough to offset those sorts of things. And, everybody's going to talk about talent and all those sorts of things. And Florida's not a less talented team than Vanderbilt, far from it. But it doesn't matter how talented you are when you just hand them everything that they get. And, they had one long drive or two long drives. And even on those drives, there were unsportsmanlike conduct penalties that prolonged one drive. There was the face mask that prolonged the same drive. And they gave him 30 yards on one of their touchdown drives just from personal fouls. You get the unnecessary roughness on Egwekin after the 15-yard run by Johnson to open up that final run of the final drive of the first half for Florida. You've got the targeting on Miller. Like, it was just, flags everywhere.
And for those who haven't read Will's breakdown of the Vanderbilt game, he's got a nice list of all these mistakes.
Oh, I have them all there.
I was impressed with just how many bullet points you went through and listed there, Will.
Dude, I calculated that if Florida had made all the plays they could have, like the Kamari Wilson pick six that hits his hands, could have taken it the other way. The next play is the punt that gets muffed that turns into a touchdown. Like, there were opportunities. And the Wilson play and the Marshall play, right? Like, I think we both look at Marshall and go, God, why are you fielding that going backwards? Like, plant your feet at the 10. Right. If it's over your head, let it go. But irrespective of that, right? Like, once he decided to make the catch, that's a tough play. That's a physical error in many respects. The illegal formation is day one install. On a running play, you have to have 7 guys on the line of scrimmage. And I'm sorry, like, it's day one install. Like, just the guy who's, and I think it was Chickacao Bowman, whoever's not on the line of scrimmage, it's inexcusable. You have to be on the line of scrimmage. They had exactly what they wanted. Vanderbilt, it was interesting because, I've had a bunch of people reach out and go, well, Vanderbilt was trying to stop the run. That's not true. Vanderbilt was playing a cover 2 shell and zone pretty much the entire game. They switched over to cover 1 a few times, typically on third down, typically on third and long. And that's when Richardson took those shots down the sideline. And they kind of wanted him to take those shots down the sideline. And you saw why, because on a few of them, he missed the guy by 10 yards when he was taking that shot down the sideline. But they were not opening that up very often. They were kind of daring Florida to run the ball, but they were dominant up front. And so, their front four just absolutely whipped Florida's offensive line. And I'm sorry, like, you can talk about Anthony Richardson needs to run more, and that's true. He didn't have any rushes in the first half, and then they came out and he had 2 rushes to open up the drive where they scored the touchdown. And then they got so far behind they had to chuck the ball. But
right,
in many ways, this is, everyone was asleep, including the coaches. It was a bad game plan, and in many ways, I think them looking ahead to Florida State, right? One of the reasons they didn't run Richardson, I suspect, is because they knew they had a short week coming up and they wanted him to be able to run against Florida State. It was a bad game plan, bad execution, just bad effort all around. The whole performance was bad. And that's what happens. You can lose to Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt's not great, but Vanderbilt is not the laughing stock that Vanderbilt has been for the last 3 or 4 years. You don't just get to show up and win by 40 points. You got to actually play. And Florida decided they were just going to show up. And it turns out Vanderbilt came out and said, hey, we're going to smack him in the mouth. And, that's what happens. You lose by a touchdown.
No, it's funny. It's funny you say that, because the thought I've been having is I'm 30, I'm 36 years old. And throughout most of my life, Florida's had some incredible streaks against some of these the lesser tier opponents in the SEC here. Going back to 1988, where we haven't lost a road game at Vanderbilt. Going back, we had the 32 game win streak against Kentucky. Was it? We've had some incredible streaks against these teams we play year in and year out. We are entering an era of the SEC where the floor is beginning to rise. I'm not saying the floor has risen yet and we should be losing to Vanderbilt right now. Not saying that at all, because we shouldn't. Vanderbilt, though, is going to slowly get better. I feel like Kentucky has reached and climbed up a little bit. They definitely are not your 1990s, early 2000s Kentucky teams that Florida would just roll over and even would still struggle with in some years, right? So these teams are going to continue to get better. When we lose these 20, 30-year streaks, we may never put together this type of streak again against the Vanderbilts and Kentuckys of the world, because I do feel like the floor is rising in the SEC. And we're seeing that we talked about it with Vanderbilt, where we like the plan with Simmons, we like the plan with Lee. And even though they were 14th in the SEC in recruiting, they were number 32 in the country in recruiting last year. So they're bringing talent into that program. They are raising the floor on that program, although it's not there quite yet. So point is, say goodbye to these 30-year streaks. I don't think we're reconstructing them anytime soon. You might have to deal with an occasional loss to a Kentucky, to a Vanderbilt, those type of things. That's the new SEC, the new world we live in. Now let's talk about specifically with the game. Will 19 combined carries for a group, the three-headed monster of Etienne, Johnson, and Richardson, that combined for 47 carries against South Carolina and 46 against A&M. 12 of those 19, I believe, came in the first half here, Will. So they were trying to run a little bit in the first half. Second half, you come out. A lot of that first drive of the second half was on Richardson and getting it done with Richardson there. However, once you go down 28-12, game plan's out the window, regardless of what. If you came in wanting to run the ball, it's all on Richardson at that point, isn't it? It's all on the passing game on that point, and that's why I think you see a game where Richardson throws the ball for over 40 times and 400 yards.
Yeah, I mean, look, so they came out and they stopped Vanderbilt and got a punt. They drive down the field, get the field goal on the dropped ball from for Montreal Johnson. So, hey, the first drive was a success other than the drop and the bad snap. I mean, it looked like they weren't all there. Then the defense starts to give up some stuff to Vanderbilt, but then gets a fumble. They turn around for the fumble, get an immediate pass to Justin Shorter for 14 yards. Etienne gets a run for no gain, 2 incompletions, and all of a sudden they have to punt back. And then Vanderbilt gets the touchdown, aided by the unnecessary roughness penalty by Human Meelan and the face mask by Antoine Powell-Ryland. And Florida, as the first quarter's ending, or the second quarter, I guess, because they scored in the second quarter there, as the second quarter is beginning, Florida's behind 7-3 and has completely dominated the game so far, right? Then you get the drive for the field goal, where if they get that 27-yard run from Montreal Johnson because they actually lined up correctly, that's another touchdown Florida left. And then you get the fumble return on the punt. Obviously, they force the 3 and out, and then they get the punt and the fumble and gets collected. It's 14-6, and Florida's dominated the first half in terms of what they're actually, from a yardage perspective, they were pretty similar, but in many ways, I felt like Florida dominated that first half, but they're down by 8 points. Florida averaged 7 yards an attempt in this game. Vanderbilt averaged 4.6. If you told me that was the spread before the game, I would have told you Florida won by 25. And I think that's really the story, is all the mistakes that we both have just been, clicking off over and over and over again. I mean, there were 41 points out there where Florida had made any of those opportunities. They could have shifted it by 4 points. They could have shifted it by 7 points. They could have shifted by 1 point just by making the extra point, all those different things. And it turns out when you do all of those things wrong and stack all of those things together, you lose. Look, I don't think it's acceptable to lose to Vanderbilt because Vanderbilt's not the better team. I mean, you look at the statistics in this one, and I just go, yes, if you played this over and over and over again with the way the game sort of played out, the win probability percentage, I think, has Vanderbilt at like 81, 82% of the post-game win percentage. But still, I go back and look at that game. I don't feel that way. Like, I look at it and I go, Florida had an opportunity. And this is one of the things. There have been a lot of people who've criticized Billy Napier for his play calling. And in many ways, they're criticizing him for not being aggressive enough. And I look at it and I go, I think he was too aggressive. Like, if you're going to criticize him for anything, you're sitting there in a cover 2 shell. Anthony Richardson's chucking the ball 30 or 50 yards deep to Justin Shorter. For the love of God, run him out of it. Right? Like, just, run the ball on the edges, run them
especially
out
when that's what you do well.
Well, all of that stuff. So, I mean,
right.
They had to rely on Anthony Richardson, but they didn't have to rely on him coming. I mean, they had the game 14-12, right? And after the opening touchdown to start the second half, the game is a 2-point game. Even after that, Vanderbilt comes down and scores another touchdown. It's still a 2-possession game. You have the ability to run the ball, and they decided not to. And they went to the pass, and it was successful. Anthony Richardson played really, really well. Problem is, nobody else did. Like, the entire, I mean, even go back and look at some of the pass plays. Richardson was running around. He was getting a lot of pressure when there were free blitzer, or when there were blitzers. They weren't necessarily always getting picked up. There were other flaws in different places here where, look, I mean, it's Vanderbilt. You got to be able to drive them off the line of scrimmage. Florida rushes 21 times for 45 yards, 2.1 yards per rush. Vanderbilt only averaged 3.8 yards per rush, but they were consistent about it. 46 attempts, drained the clock. They only had 16 passes for 108 yards, so 6.8 yards per pass. Look, I mean, that profile is almost, I mean, the running yardage is a little bit higher, but the 4.6 yards per play, I'd have to go back and look at it. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, South Carolina averaged 4.7. So from the standpoint of like where the teams actually sat, look, I mean, this was the exact same defensive performance, except for all the penalties and all the screw ups and all the different things where Florida's offense said, "Here you go, Vanderbilt, right on a silver platter." And then the defense said, "Well, we don't think we've given you enough. Let's punch somebody in the back right after the play just to make sure that we give you 15 yards on a third down stop." And you know what? Those are the things. And this is what I said in the article. And I think what I really believe about this game is you can criticize the play calling all you want. The thing you need to criticize is after every one of those ungodly penalties, the guy was still on the field on the next play. And we got mad and upset, and everybody criticized Dan Mullen when the shoe toss happened against LSU, and they're like, "Oh, Marco Wilson's still out there, and why did he not pull him off the field?" I'm like, "Geez, I mean, if you just randomly on a third down when your defense gets off the field, push somebody in the back, and yes, the offensive lineman pushed Human Milan down." But the whistle hadn't blown yet. Like, isn't that sort of his job? And you get mad and you push him in the back after the play, and all of a sudden now you cost your team a first down. Like, those sorts of things need to have consequences, because if they don't, they're going to keep happening. And they kept happening the entire game.
Right. It's not a bad holding call, or, with like Bernie had that holding call that wasn't a smart penalty, but I mean, he was playing the game. It wasn't a total, I guess you could call that a discipline thing too, actually.
Well, I mean, but you can,
because situationally that was a stupid play by Bernie.
Yeah, but you can deal with a few of those, right? Like a few things that are
guys are playing hard. He's at least playing hard.
Yeah, effort plays, like the Ventrell Miller targeting, right?
Let's talk about that. Is that so? I went back and watched it, and he did lower, like he went and lowered his head into him. The hit, though, is really, you see the shoulders, you see the arms follow through on the hit too. Is that something worth appealing so that he can play? He can play the first half of FSU, because I'll tell you what, we'll get to that in the FSU preview. But boy, it'd be nice to have a run stopper like Ventrell Miller in the first half.
I mean, I'm sure Florida will appeal, because they'd like to have him back. I think by the letter of the law, it was probably a correct call. I think we can argue targeting all year long. I think this targeting was less egregious than the roughing the passer penalty against Desmond Watson earlier in the year, or Gervon Dexter earlier in the year
against LSU.
Against LSU. That one was like by the letter of the law.
Two of those calls have been played a big part in two of our losses. Will, I'm not a big fan of this. Like, we gotta adjust the severity of the rule. I feel like I think it's well intentioned, but the fact is that was a bang bang play. And fine, you want to, okay, let's say the ejection's worthy, the call's worthy, fine. But what price are we paying that this guy's sitting out the first half of FSU? Like, can we like come back a little bit to earth on some of this? Because I don't know, man. If he's going to miss the first half of FSU, that's kind of rough for that.
We can complain about it all we want. I mean, if I was the czar of college football, I would have a red card, yellow card system, right? Where if it's intentional and egregious, and you come in and you launch and you really make helmet to helmet contact, and it's a defenseless guy. Like,
you're acknowledging a difference between certain hits there.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. But what I will say, and this is something that I think is worth thinking about, is two things. One, college offenses have gotten a lot more prolific over the last 5 or 6 years. I think a lot of it has to do with they're willing to send guys over the middle that they weren't willing to send over the middle. And so the targeting rule is working from the standpoint of guys are not getting obliterated when they come across the middle like they used to a decade ago. Now, you can say, okay, that's like not big boy football or whatever, but look, the NCAA and the conferences are far more worried about getting sued than they are about a guy
advocating for that.
Game.
That's not what I'm advocating for. And I'm saying, like, I can remember those hits all growing up, right? Like, we watched you had the head hunting safeties back in the day. Man, as a Jags fan, every Jags fan probably remembers that Donovan Darius hit. I want to say it was on Donald Driver over the middle. Like, he nearly knocked his head off back in the day. But I'm not advocating to bring back those type of hits, because I understand the point of the rule. What I'm saying, though, is the severity of the rule. Not only the ejection, which I have a problem with the ejection at all, but yet alone you're going to serve it's a full game ejection to the point where you're serving the first half of the next game. What are we doing here? I've never liked that rule.
Well, here's the deal, Nick. It was a rule passed because they were afraid of getting sued.
Right.
and they are not going to backtrack on a player safety rule. They're not going to backtrack on the severity. They're just not, because the minute they backtrack on the severity, then somebody's going to sue them and go, look, they decided that they could actually make it easier, and some guy's going to get hit, and he's going to get a yellow card instead of a red card, and they're going to be like, well, this is the one that scrambled his brain, and you only gave it a yellow, which incentivizes people to make these hits, and so you're financially liable. They're not ever going to backtrack it. So we can sit here and argue about it every time Florida gets a targeting call. We can sit here and stomp our feet and go, somebody shouldn't get ejected. They're not going to change it. So you know what? You're a defender. You got to know that. You can't lower the crown of your helmet. Hit them with your hands. Do what you got to do. Or just deal with the fact that every once in a while you're going to have a guy suspended. You know what would really be helpful is if Florida had a linebacker behind Ventrell Miller who could step in and actually play as well as Ventrell Miller, which is what this program is trying to build up to. So, look, I think it's like, I feel bad for him because it's his last game, or at least last regular season game with Florida, and he's going to miss the first half. Hopefully he comes back in the second half, plays really well against Florida State. Them's the rules. Happens to everybody. Vanderbilt had one very, very similar in the first half that did the exact same thing. In fact, prolonged, I think, Florida's first touchdown drive. So, look, those things happen sometimes. It's just the way it is. They're not going to backtrack it, so there's no real sense in arguing over it.
It's not a Florida issue. It's a college football issue for me. I'd like
well,
to
I
see
get
that.
it, old man.
I'd
I
like to see
understand
that
that you want to yell at the clouds, but nothing's going to happen.
No.
You can yell at the clouds all you want.
I'd like to see some common sense applied. No, I'd like to see some common sense applied.
Since when is lawsuits and common sense meshed? This is a risk aversion.
There is room for discussion.
Not a common sense strategy.
You're just not open to for whatever reason, but there is room for discussion on this.
No, I hate the rule
topic.
too. I'm just not going to whine about it because my team happened to.
It's not whining. I'm saying when you see something. First off, there used to be a penalty in college football in the '80s when the crowd noise was too loud. All right, go look up Jim Harbaugh in the Rose Bowl. He stepped back because they're calling penalties on Arizona State because their crowd was too loud. They've gotten rid of stupid rules before. They've backtracked on dumb rules before. You can bring it back. It's a good intention, but the way it's being enforced, I'm not sure I agree totally with the way it's enforced. I think it's a little too severe right now.
But here's the thing is that you only get up on your high horse and complain about it when it actually impacts Florida negatively or Ohio State, since you're a closet Buckeye.
We're a Florida talk show, man. I'm not sure. I'm sure I could come up with a great point about San Jose State, but no one here is going to give it to them. So
you're the one talking about the crowd noise with Jim Harbaugh back in the 1980s.
I'm pointing out that they backtracked on losing their hearing. Rules. You never know, Will. You never know. You said there's no logic in lawsuits, right? So anyway, let's get back to the game here.
Vandy, no, let's not. Let's move on. I don't want to talk about Vandy anymore.
Well, Deshawn Reynolds, real quick. I want to give a shout out. That was a nice performance there by Deshawn Reynolds. Breakout performance there. 8 receptions, 165 yards, 2 touchdowns, Will.
Yeah, I'm impressed that he caught that second one in the end zone on the last touchdown because the ball hit his face mask before he actually caught it.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, 2 in a row on the exact same route. That might not have gone over well with the fan base, but no, he was great, right? I mean, obviously hits the big pass from Richardson where Richardson's on his back waving. That was kind of funny. Made a lot of nice plays in the first half too. Florida needs guys to step up. Justin Shorter's been out. Pearsall came out because of injuries. Jaquavian Frazier's obviously out as well. So, we've sort of talked all year long, especially early in the year, that it was just those 3 guys and they didn't have anybody else in there. Frazier's has stepped up a little bit and made the nice catch against Texas A&M, but got hurt on the touchdown catch. And now you've got these other guys jumping in. So I feel a little bit more comfortable about where Florida's receivers are going into next year. But again, I mean, Florida's receivers torched Vanderbilt's defensive backs. Vanderbilt's the worst defense in the SEC. I think we need to take that into account.
A guy we haven't seen, though, do it. Reynolds, real breakout game for him, though.
Yeah, absolutely. We saw Chicago Bowman quite a bit in this one, too. I mean, look, there were new faces out there, and that's good to see. But I'm not sure that there's probably a correlation between all the mistakes that were going on and all the new faces we saw as well. So,
yeah. All right, rough outing in Nashville. Let's move on. Let's put it behind us here. Let's move on. Let's talk about this. Is something we saw this. You mentioned this in your article too, Will, and we saw this going around Twitter yesterday. Just it feels like Richardson gets a lot of heat anytime we lose. Obviously, you're the quarterback. You're going to get the blame. You're going to get the credit when you win. But I don't think he certainly the word you use for our offense. I thought the phrase you used I thought was almost perfect. Feast or famine, and that's how it's been with Richardson this year. And we've gone through the growing pains with this guy. Certainly we were very high on him, and he hasn't lived up to that expectation. But he hasn't been a total bum either. We've gone through a decade of pretty weak quarterback play at the University of Florida, and this guy definitely is much better than some of the guys who have tried it out into the field over the last decade. But for perspective here, let's look at your SEC YAR rankings and let's see how he checks out. And because it's FSU week, you included Jordan Travis in the mix here with the SEC guys. So Will, tell us about the YAR rankings. Remind people what they are. If we have any new listeners, remind people what YAR is and help them break that down.
Yeah, so YAR is yards above replacement, and it's a play on a baseball statistic that's called wins above replacement, where basically if you put in somebody who's average, how much better is the player than average? So if you have a YAR of 0, that means you're exactly average. If you're below 0, then it means you're below average, obviously. If you're above 0, then you're above average. When you get to a YAR of about 1, that's somebody who's pretty good and good enough with a good defense to really do some stuff. So like think Jake Fromm back in the Georgia 2017, 2018 seasons. Fromm was usually around 0.9, 0.98, I think was his best year. So with an elite defense, Fromm was really able to get Georgia on the cusp of national championship. But I think you could argue that Fromm was one of the things sort of holding them back from being able to sort of go over the top. A guy like Stetson Bennett sort of fits that mold as well. Once you get to a YAR of about 2, you're talking a guy with a Heisman Trophy candidacy. So Kyle Trask was up around 1.7, 1.8 back in 2020. So not quite where you would expect. And then guys like Kyler Murray and Michael Vick are up in the 3 to 4 range where you just go, wow, these guys are unbelievable. And the idea is that it takes both running and passing into account. So we're looking mainly at yards per attempt on both sides and saying, look, if you take a bunch of sacks and you only throw for 5 yards an attempt, you may have a ton of attempts, you may have a ton of yards, you may be Will Rogers at Mississippi State, but you're not really all that effective as a quarterback from an efficiency standpoint. So you look at Rogers, his YAR for the season is negative 1.66. Part of that is because he's got 33 rushes for minus 135 yards, but part of it also is he's got 527 attempts, which is 200 more attempts than any of the other quarterbacks in the SEC. And so, yeah, he's thrown for 3,500 yards, but he's only averaged 6.6 yards per attempt. So Mike Leach puts the ball up a ton. But the problem is he's not very efficient when he does it. And so they don't score as many points as they could if they had a more efficient quarterback there. Will Levis, he ranks 12th overall in the SEC. He averages 8.4 yards per attempt, but he's also 67 rushes, negative 97 yards. So if you want to wonder why a guy who's got a QB rating of 150.2, hey, that's pretty good. But his YAR's negative 0.52. I think he's below average because I think his decision making is bad. And one of the things that is he holds onto the ball too long. And when he holds onto the ball too long, he gets sacked. And it turns out when you get sacked on 1st and 10, the drive's pretty much over. Kentucky doesn't have a very good offensive line either, so that does have an impact there. But he doesn't have the ability to move, to feel the pressure, those sorts of things. So all sort of that intuitive, everybody knows Will Levis isn't a first-round pick except for these guys who are putting together the mock drafts. And that intuitive thing that we all look at and go, that guy's not a first-round draft pick. Like, the reason it's intuitive, it has to do with the way he manages the pocket and all the sacks he takes. So you look at a guy like Anthony Richardson, who has a QB rating of 131.6, well below Levis at 150.2, below Spencer Rattler at 141.4, below Will Rogers at 141.6. But what Richardson has, he has 93 rushes for 609 yards. So he's averaging 6.5 yards per rush. His yards above replacement, 0.77. So what I'm saying is that he is worse than Jake Fromm for Georgia in 2017, but very, very much above average. And he brings a lot to the table with his ability to run the ball and his ability to make explosive plays. He's averaging 7.8 yards per attempt, which is right about where the average quarterback is. We'll see at the end of the year. I'll sort of renormalize these based on the overall year. The yards per attempt are actually a little bit down this year, so Richardson's value might actually go up based on that. You look at the overall SEC, though, Hendon Hooker's number 1 overall, but his yards above replacement's 1.49. So what this says is there really isn't a Heisman Trophy level quarterback, at least not from performance this year, in the SEC. And that's one of the reasons why Georgia's been able to run roughshod. Stetson Bennett's at 0.76, just a little bit worse than Anthony Richardson, actually. He's averaged 8.6 yards per attempt. He's averaged 4.2 yards per rush. His QB rating's at 150. I mean, look, he has been a perfectly acceptable signal caller for Georgia. He has not been fantastic, which is how you end up with that close game against Missouri, the close game against Kentucky the other day. Is Bennett is just not a difference maker, but he's got a defense that is fantastic. And since there's no quarterback in the SEC who's been able to really be sort of rise above the Georgia defense, like a Tua, like a Mac Jones, somebody like that. There hasn't been anybody out there who can beat Georgia specifically. We'll see whether Jaden Daniels can. Now, Daniels is an interesting case. I expected him to be higher because he's got 162 rushes for 740 yards, but it turns out that's only 4.6 yards per attempt. So while he runs a ton, he's not that efficient. And then he's also only averaged 7.6 yards per throw. His yards at 0.32. So again, above average, but not as good as Stetson Bennett. Let's be honest. In the SEC championship game, Jaden Daniels is going to have to be a lot better than Stetson Bennett in order for LSU to win that game. So,
Right.
Look, I think it's interesting. You look at it, Jordan Travis is at 1.08. He'd be second in the SEC overall. Obviously, Florida State has not played the level of talent that, say, a team like Florida has. Then you got Jackson Dart at Ole Miss, KJ Jefferson at Arkansas, Florida, Anthony Richardson, then Mike Wright for Vanderbilt. Hasn't had a ton of snaps, but he's right there, though he didn't play real well against Florida yesterday. Then you got Stetson Bennett, Jaden Daniels. Bryce Young for Alabama ranks 9th overall in YAR, which is interesting because what it basically says is he hasn't been that efficient. He's averaged 8.1 yards per attempt. He's averaged 3.6 yards per rush. He's at 0.22. So sort of right there with Jaden Daniels, which is how you end up with Alabama losing to LSU, right? I think we can all agree. When you look at it, you go, Bryce Young makes all these awesome throws. His QB rating's at 154. Like, Alabama should be really, really consistent. And then you start actually looking at the Alabama offense and you go, it just feels like a slog sometimes. And that, I think YAR actually captures that. I think YAR captures that sort of feeling we have about a quarterback, right? Like Stetson Bennett's at 150. Everybody's like, oh, that's really, really good. But there's just this thing where it's like there's stuff that holds him back, and we can see that in the statistics. So I think it's a useful one. And the other thing is that I think it sort of suggests when I get really confused at the Florida fans for the most part. I mean, again, maybe this is just a small subset on Twitter, but the people who get mad at Anthony Richardson when they lose, the only times you could really be mad at him this year are against Kentucky. He lost that game. He was the reason. USF, he was the reason it was close. Missouri, he was the reason that one was close. Georgia, he was negative. And then South Carolina, he was negative. And everybody talked about him turning a corner after the South Carolina game. He was really bad in the second half of that game. Against A&M, he had a positive yards above replacement. LSU, the same thing. Tennessee, the same thing. Utah, the same thing. And now Vanderbilt, the same thing. He had a yards above replacement like 1.7. Like, it was very, very high, almost to what you would consider a Heisman level performance. Now, look, I mean, I think you can complain with the 6 points in the first half and that he's not running the ball enough and all those sorts of things. But his usage rate was 71% in this game. Like, he was the Florida offense. No one was helping him. And he almost managed to lead him back in this one, and probably would have if they'd caught a damn punt. So, I sort of look at it and say, the fact that Anthony Richardson's getting shade on this one, I just don't get it all. Where he sits in the SEC in terms of his overall efficiency is in the top 5. And, I think really when you look at it, he's an effective player, even if an inconsistent one. And that's kind of the story of YAR, right? He's at 0.77 for the year. That's a guy who is above average, but it's also a guy who's going to be inconsistent from time to time, because you don't get there without having a couple of negative games too. And he's been that way. It's been positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative all year long. We just got a positive against Vanderbilt. We're going to finally need 2 in a row if Florida's going to beat Florida State, and we'll see if he's got it in him.
Yeah, he's an interesting case because I think people will remember the missed throws. There'll be easy missed throws here or there, but then they'll pop off and hit a big play. I mean, even that fourth down where they scored, was it the first drive of the second half? Well, the fourth down where that was a nice pass there between the safety and the corner on that. He laid that in there pretty nicely. I believe it was Shorter on that fourth down. So really Richardson yesterday, if Richardson's not on the field and Jack Miller's on the field, what does that look like yesterday? Or Kitna, what does that look like yesterday?
Well, maybe a more focused team, and that's maybe the one thing you can say is that this team, based on the level of talent that they have at the quarterback position, I think maybe that they rely on Anthony Richardson too much, and that there are times where they just say, "Go make us play, buddy." And instead of everybody going out there and going, "Oh, we have a limited quarterback, we're going to have to, all pull our weight." And nobody pulled their weight in this one against Vanderbilt. And I mean, look, I think there are things you can criticize about Richardson, like the turnover on downs at the 12 on 2nd and 3. He had a guy coming right across the middle who was wide open. He could have dumped it to him, had an easy first down there. Instead, he ends up chucking the ball into the stands because he starts to feel some pressure, even though he had the guy open. And really that's what you're trying to do is get that first down, get the guy out of bounds, get the drive moving, all that sort of stuff. He's not a 2-minute quarterback. Like, you're not going to put him in the 2-minute drill and say, hey, go get it. Like, it's not Pat Mahomes with 13 seconds left against Buffalo. Go get me a field goal and, driving down the field. The throw to Chicago Bowman that almost set up the Hail Mary was a really nice throw. And he has that in him. It's just not something that happens consistently. And they're not at that place yet. I think, look, I think everybody sees that Richardson would probably benefit from another year in college, but he has so many skills and so much talent that I think it's going to be hard. I texted you yesterday that he's going to be the perfect Raider, right? He's the guy, he's the guy who has like all of the physical skills, but it doesn't have any of the polish. And another year in college would probably give him the polish. But hey, somebody's going to fall in love with the fact that he runs a 4.4. Somebody's going to fall in love with the fact that he has a cannon. I don't expect he's going to come back, but if he does, I think he has an opportunity to be a legend at Florida, because if he can just make the negative games, like the negative yard games, be zero, then all of a sudden you're talking about a Heisman level campaign, given all the upset he's had this year. And I just don't get it. I don't get the vitriol towards Richardson. Yeah, there are probably some times that he should run the ball that he doesn't. There are probably some throws that he misses, but to your point, the other people they put in there would be such steps down from what we're seeing so far that I don't know why he's the center of the issues. And again, I looked at the first 3 drives again today just to make sure I didn't miss anything. Cover 2 shell, 6 men in the box. There was an opportunity to run the entire time, and Florida was back there passing. And that's on Napier, right? I mean, that's on Napier, that's on the staff, that's on them thinking that they were going to be able to dive bomb Vanderbilt really quickly through the air and get up really quickly. And then when that didn't happen, not being able to adjust and saying, okay, now we're going to put it on the ground. We're going to run it first down, second down, third down, and challenge our offensive line to go get a first down until they bring a safety down into the box. They never made him do it. And when you never make him bring a safety into the box, it makes it really hard for the quarterback, because he's got to throw against 8 guys dropping or 7 guys dropping. And now you got to hit tight windows, and now you got to make the ball has to be perfect in order to give the guy a running start into the zone. The fact that he threw 1 pick and that it really wasn't his fault, even though I wish he just held on to that ball, but he throws 1 pick, not really his fault. Most of the throws were on target yesterday. Like, I don't remember the fourth down one that he overthrew. Everybody's going to remember, but you mentioned the fourth down one that he made on the first drive of the second half. He also did on the first drive of the game, where he hit Deshawn Reynolds for 31 yards on a 4th down and 7, where they were going for it in Vanderbilt territory, and keeps that drive going. And he puts the ball right on Montreal Johnson's hands and it just falls off. There were like 5 or 6 drops yesterday too, that could have changed things as well. So, like, is Richardson perfect? Absolutely not. But the idea that anytime Florida loses, it's a referendum on whether he's the right quarterback for the team, I just don't get. Like, you had people coming out after the Tennessee game where he throws for 430 yards.
It's probably one of his best performances.
I mean, if he did that every week, Florida be 8-2, and to say he's got that in him, but it doesn't come out every week, I don't think is a diminishing thing for Richardson. It's the peaks are really high and the troughs are really low.
Well, so the inconsistency is definitely a reason to come back. It's definitely a reason to come back and develop and work on that consistency. Now, unless you have an opportunity to go like top 10 or top 15, you're alluding to the fact that you think he might go anyway. Are you hearing anything about him being drafted that high?
Yeah,
because I'd be totally stunned after what he's put on tape this year if he was top 15 pick.
I think he's first round draft pick. I think he has physical tools that will entice some team to say, we're going to sit him for a year and we're going to just have him learn the offense and we're going to work with him on his mechanics. And we think that, some team's going to talk themselves into, if we get him at 27th, 28th, 29th in the draft, that next year he'd be the number 1 pick. And so what we're really doing is we're taking him away from Billy Napier for a year of development. We're bringing him into our program for a year of development. And, it's going to be a redshirt year essentially in the NFL, where he comes in, he sits behind somebody. So like, you think about a team like, the Titans that you saw with Malik Willis the other night when Tannehill was hurt, and Willis comes in completely unprepared to be able to lead that Titans team. And you could see it. They were trying to protect him. They were trying not to run the ball. So like a team like the New York Giants, right, who's got Daniel Jones, but doesn't really want Daniel Jones long term. Could they bring in a guy like Richardson but sit him behind a guy like Jones, where he learns the offense, he comes in, he has a package, all that sort of stuff? And then, but the physical tools just are going to take over sometimes. I don't think that's the best way to evaluate quarterbacks. I think anybody comparing him to Justin Fields is mistaken because Fields was lighting up Clemson in the college football playoff, and Richardson has not risen to that level yet. But I just don't like, and this is the thing when I always point out high school
Fields
completion
was also
percentage.
pretty consistent week to week. It was pretty
Yeah.
solid performance week in
Well,
and week
but
out
here's
with
the thing:
Fields.
whenever I start talking about high school completion percentage for high school guys and how it translates, everybody looks at it and is like, it just feels like it gets a collective yawn. But you can kind of predict who the busts are going to be, especially from that statistic. And it's interesting to me that people's eyes override their evaluation of the analytics when it comes to these guys. You get a guy who comes in as a 5-star guy. Like, it was obvious that Bo Nix was limited when he came to Auburn. Now, look, he's played really, really well for Oregon this year. But but part of that is he's in the Pac-12 and not in the SEC at this point,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it was pretty obvious, especially when Auburn decided to play him his true freshman year, that he was going to struggle because yes, he has all of these physical tools, but those tools had not translated to production on the field. I think the same thing applies for Richardson, but look, I mean, it only takes one, right? I mean, Sebastian Janikowski wound up going in the first round because Al Davis loved his leg. And if you're willing to take a kicker because of his physical gifts in the first round, and I mean, let's be honest, we've all seen his kid's haircut. So you make decisions like that, you're going to draft guys who have potential.
I mean, it's not. I do think if he were to come back and have a great year next year, he could. I mean, we were talking before this season. He was in mock draft, but it wasn't just us feeding hype. It was Mel Kiper, Todd McShay. These guys got him top 10 of the draft in their mock draft. So I know people see this with this guy. However, I do think in the era of NIL, and I think they've been reporting that he's making over $1 million so far this year. Like that, this guy can come back. He can make good amount of money, develop his skill, and get that top 15, top 10 spot next year. I wonder how many millions of dollars. I'm not totally familiar with first round NFL contract structures, but I guarantee there's a major difference between being drafted number 7 versus being number 26 in the draft.
Sure, but the bigger difference is if you're a second or a third round pick. And so if he's going to drop to third round, then NIL starts to be competitive. If you're going to be in the first or the second round, then the NFL is probably more competitive. And look, I mean, far be it for me to tell the guy that he should turn down millions of dollars and his dream to spend one more year in Gainesville. Now, I look at it and say, you're from Gainesville. If you stay for a year and really help rebuild this thing and put up an elite season next year, then you're a legend, right? But the risk is if you're going to be a first round pick, like let's say you're going to be a first round pick and then you tear up your knee next year, you got the NIL dollars and that's great, but your long term, your long term financial stability is impacted by that. And a guy with his kind of tools is going to be a backup quarterback in the league for 10 years at a minimum. I mean, he'll move around, even if it turns out when people give him a shot, he doesn't play real well. As long as he's studious, as long as he's responsible, as long as he shows up ready to go. I mean, the Chase Daniels of the world get those opportunities because they're ready when their numbers called, but their numbers called very, very infrequently. And a guy with his kind of tools is going to get that opportunity multiple times at a bare minimum. And so, look, if you're a second round draft pick, I think a second round pick average like $9 million total guaranteed. You got $9 million in your pocket. What can you do with that? Are you going to get $9 million guaranteed from NIL? Maybe, but not for a year, I don't think. And if you're not going to get $9 million guaranteed from NIL, then it's a smarter move to go to the NFL. And you have the opportunity to get your second contract a year earlier in a league where everybody looks at your age when they start talking about renegotiating those sorts of things. So I see it. I mean, no one, like, the NFL isn't stupid. Like, the evaluators aren't going to sit there and go, yeah, throw this guy in day one. He's ready. Peyton Manning. It's like, no. But if somebody takes him in the first round or the second round, that money is going to be way better than what he's going to get through NIL. And so I don't begrudge him that. I mean, look, go take care of you, take care of your family, and do what's best for you.
Interesting perspective there, Will. That's another look at YAR. You said you're gonna update that at the end of the season too. You're
Yeah,
gonna put
yeah.
an article out with that at the end of the season, so
We'll put it
people
at the end
want
of
to
the
follow
season
that.
so people can look at it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. All right, let's move on to 6 bits here and talk about those Florida State Seminoles. Offensively, FSU leads the ACC in rushing with 217.4 yards per game, third in the league with 256.7 passing yards per game. And the Noles average just over 35 points per outing. Jordan Travis has thrown for 10 touchdowns and one pick during the last 4 games. They've won the last 4 games coming into this one. Running back Troy Benson has racked up 462 yards during the same stretch. I believe he's the guy that Mario Cristobal tried to take credit for after absolutely shredding Cristobal on the Canes. He had recruit Oregon transfer there. So he tried to take a little bit of credit for that one. Florida is not going to stop this offense, Will, overall, but they're going to score. FSU is going to score. But my big question is, can we slow the run game and put this game completely in Travis's hands? Because Travis, if you just watch him a little bit and see his running ability, you would think he runs a lot more than he actually does, but he really only averages a little over 5 carries a game. And they can hit big plays in that passing game. I think the biggest pro Mike Norvell ad that Florida State can put together this season, it's been a nice season. They're 8-3. They're coming around a little bit. But offensively, let's talk about that FSU offense first here, Will. Jordan Travis has really developed into a nice quarterback where a year ago, I'm not sure I saw this level of development coming from him. So Norvell's done a good job with Travis, done a good job with that offense, certainly can beat you through the air, but you just can't let them do both. And right now, Florida State's kind of doing whatever they want on the ground and through the air. So I would say if I'm Florida, I'm making Benson the priority. I'm trying to shut down that run and put the game entirely in Travis's hands on this one.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know. I haven't looked at the film yet to really understand exactly what Florida's going to be up against. I know it's ugly. So Florida State leads the country in 20+ yard plays. So explosive plays overall, they lead the country. I think you also look Trey Benson, their leading running back, is averaging 7.1 yards per carry. He also has 10 catches. And then you look at Lawrence Teofili, who's got 88 carries for 422 yards, but then he's got 23 catches for 266. And then Treshaun Ward, who has 81 carries, he's also got 6 receptions. So you look at that, that's what, 39 receptions for the running backs. And that's a problem for Florida, especially if Ventrell Miller's out, right? That the Florida linebackers have just been bad from the standpoint of being able to cover guys out in the flat. Those guys have been open an awful lot. And with those guys being open an awful lot, is going to come big plays. So, you can look at Micah Pittman, but he's only transfer from Oregon. He's only averaged 10.9 yards per reception. Guy like Darian Williamson only has 6 catches. He's averaging 18. Johnny Wilson is really the real weapon at wide receiver, averaging 19.7 yards per catch, but only 33 catches. Things have been spread around pretty good though, right? You got 33 for Johnny Wilson. You got 24 for Ontario Wilson, 19 for Cameron McDonald, 11 for Kentron Poitier, and then 10 for Markston Douglas. So they've spread it around pretty good, and the 28 for Micah Pittman. So they spread around pretty good in terms of their different receivers. So Florida's not going to be able to key in on any one guy. They're going to be able to pick the matchup that they want to isolate, and in doing that, if Travis can find his guy in a matchup, I mean, look, Florida struggled at times to stop Vanderbilt in matchups, so I don't suspect they're going to be able to stop Florida State. This one's either going to hit the over or Florida State's going to win big. That's sort of the two options in this one, probably.
Well, and you look at the FSU defense, one of the stingiest in the ACC, allowing a league best 18 points per game, only 155.4 yards through the air and 138 on the ground. I'm telling you, Will, this FSU defense, I think that Florida, if you run that 3-headed monster with Richardson, Johnson, Etienne, you stick with it, that's got to be the game plan coming in. You can't fall back into a situation like we saw ourselves in with Vandy, where it becomes a Richardson show, and it's about him putting the ball up 40 times a game. We're going to get in trouble if we do that. But if we stick with the run, I know for a fact FSU has done pretty well the last few weeks here, but they have not seen a running game like we're coming in with on Friday night.
Well, it depends on which running game shows up, right?
Right.
I mean, if you've got,
I say that as in when the run game's cooking.
Well,
if we run it 19 times for 45 yards, they'll be fine.
Well, yes. Nick Knudsen, folks. Nick Knudsen. So look, they have 70 tackles for loss. That's 40th overall. Florida's offensive line's been pretty good at preventing those from happening. So this isn't a defense that's going to generate a ton of havoc. They don't have 17. This isn't Peter Boulware out there coming off the edge. Jared Verse is their leading defensive end. He's got 14 tackles for loss, 7.5 sacks. Nobody else, I think, has more than 4. Patrick Payton has 4 sacks. And then you got a bunch of guys with like 3 and 2 and that sort of stuff. So you look at it overall, and you're not probably going to see a ton of pressure on Anthony Richardson, given his ability to sort of run out of the pressure and given his ability, the offensive line's ability to protect him when they do that. So yes, if Florida can put the ball on the ground, can knock these guys back and can get some big, I mean, I don't know that you need the chunk plays. You need like the 11 and 12-yard runs that are going to enable you to move the ball down the field, keep the ball out of Jordan Travis's hands. Again, I still think, though, Florida's offense has been explosive but not consistent. That was one of the problems in the Vanderbilt game. They averaged 7 yards an attempt, but then when you actually looked at what they averaged when they weren't hitting an explosive, it was 3.9 yards per play. That split has to be closer. And the way you move that split closer is you run the ball for 7 or 8 yards at a pop. So that means you can't have ETN getting six or 7 touches. You can't have Montreal Johnson only getting 12 touches. And you got to actually go out there and run Anthony Richardson to start with. Now, I think Florida will do that because I think one of the, again, I think we can fault the staff for what they did against Vanderbilt, taking them for granted. But I think part of taking them for granted was knowing that with the short week and the Friday game against Florida State, they were trying to save Anthony Richardson, and they made a bad calculation in trying to save Richardson because now you get the loss to Vanderbilt and have to go in. And quite honestly, from a narrative standpoint, this kind of looks like a must-win rather than one where you go, well, we're 7-5. A pretty decent first season. Now you kind of got to win this to go to 7-5 and call this a decent season, especially with all the losses to the rivals this year so far. So this is a tough one. I mean, you look at it overall for Florida State, they're top 10 in terms of, hold on, let me find it here. They're ranked 10th overall in yards per play. On the offensive side of the ball, they're 7th in yards per play on the defensive side of the ball. They're 14th in points per game allowed, 19.1. They're 21st in points per game, 34.2. If you look at the offenses, they're actually pretty similar. Like Florida's worse through the air, but better on the ground. So Florida's 23rd overall in yards per play. I think if you looked at like predicted points added, they'd probably be pretty close. The problem is Florida State's defense ranks 7th overall in yards per play. Florida's 107th. So from the standpoint of like where the advantage lies, it's pretty clear. Now, again, Florida's defense had played better and even, I think, played decently against Vanderbilt. There were some hiccups, but they had played decently. And, the thing that they had been doing is they had been limiting the run game for the teams that they had played against. And for the most part, have been able to do that now. The 6 quarters coming into halftime out of Texas A&M, and they weren't terrible against Vanderbilt. So not terrible against Vanderbilt probably won't be good enough, but they have been a lot stouter against the run over the last 2 or 3 weeks. And if they're able to maintain that and put the game in Travis's hands, he has shown he'll throw the ball up. The NC State loss was just an atrocious loss for Florida State. They were going down the field. I want to say, yes, they lost 19-17, and they were in field goal range, and they decided to take a shot at it, and they threw a corner route that wound up getting intercepted by NC State. NC State did not have their starting quarterback there, at least for the second half. I can't remember exactly when he went out, but the guy that they had as the backup was a walk-on that they were afraid to let him throw the ball. So Florida State essentially got a free half in order to try to take NC State out. And they were even ahead when the starting quarterback went out, and still NC State was able to come back and get in front. They lost to Clemson, which is what we should sort of expect, 34-28, but I don't think it was that close. I didn't actually watch that game. And then they lost to Wake Forest in a game that was definitely not that close, 31-21. Other than that, they beat LSU, which is a really solid win to start the season.
That's why I want to ask that question. Everyone knows about the LSU win, Will, and that's aged like fine wine. And 24-23 kind of ignores the fact that it was almost a historic choke job by Florida State in that game. A win's a win, though, right? College football. But I really feel like the pressure is on Norvell and Florida State to deliver this weekend because you're sitting at 8-3. You're patting yourself on the back with about a nice season here. You're feeling good about yourself. And if you let the Gators come in and take care of business on Friday, that's going to create a whole offseason of questions out there in Tallahassee because I want to ask this. Even though they're a 9-point favorite and statistically they look good and everything looks like it's lining up FSU's way on paper, and based on what we saw last Saturday, FSU should take care of business here. But who's FSU's second and third best wins this year?
Syracuse, maybe. Louisville early on the year. Yeah, I mean, you start looking at who they played.
Not nearly battle tested as Florida.
And even the losses. I mean, you look at NC State, look at Wake Forest. Those are not fantastic teams. Clemson is a good team, but I don't think anybody would call them awesome, right? They are not I don't think they're a playoff team, though they might sneak in.
They're in the mix,
depending upon what happens. But I mean, I think if they get there, they're going to get destroyed by whoever they end up playing, even if it's somebody from the Pac-12. I actually think, it's funny to look at this. So Florida State was 4-3. and Florida was 4-2, and then I think lost to LSU. So they were both 4-3 at the exact same time, right? And Florida loses to Georgia to go 4-4, then wins the next two, and then obviously loses to Vanderbilt. The narrative at 6-5 is, oh man, like this is rough. But Florida State gets into that 4-3, and then who do they play? They play Georgia Tech, who'd already fired their head coach. Miami, who's got the crystal ball curse on him because, geez, he leaves and all of a sudden Oregon's good. They play Syracuse, who's a 6-5 team, and then they played Sunbelt Louisiana last week, beat them 49-17. So they got 4 straight blowout wins coming into this one, and those blowouts are the things that everybody's looking at, going, "Oh, they're finally hitting their stride." But I think the point you're making is that they hit their stride against teams that suck, and so now the question is Florida also one of those teams? And that's the thing that we just don't know, right? Is that it's entirely possible that Florida is in the class of, say, a Miami and a Syracuse and a Georgia Tech, right? And maybe not a Georgia Tech, but you think about Miami. I mean, Miami's what now, 5-6? Florida 6-5. How different is Florida than that Miami team that just got obliterated by Florida State? How different is Florida than the Syracuse?
We could put up more than 9 yards in the first half against Clemson, I'm pretty sure.
Well, I mean, it depends on which Richardson shows up, and
I don't know. We could get more than 9 yards and a half.
Yeah, I think you're probably
confident in that. Yeah.
well, good. If that doesn't happen, then we'll all blame you. But look, yes, Florida State should be the favorite because of all the statistics, but they also play in the ACC. And this is it's funny. Everybody always gets mad whenever you talk about recruiting, goes, but Clemson. I'm like, yeah, they play in the ACC. You don't have to be as good a team, and you don't have to be as good week to week to win the ACC as you do in the SEC. And so recruiting's more important in the SEC than it is in the ACC. It just is. Same thing for Florida State, right? They were lucky to win some of those close games early on. They win the game against LSU 24-23. There's a great video of the LSU guy on the sideline as they miss the extra point, just like collapsing after they get the game tying touchdown. They beat Louisville by 4. Then they lose to Wake Forest by 10. They lose to NC State by 2. They lose to Clemson by 6. And now they've got the 4 straight blowouts. So everything was close until the quality of the opponent went down. And if you look at Florida, everything was close or getting beat until they wound up playing A&M, and then there's a blowout, and then they play South Carolina, and there's a blowout. And this game would feel so much different if the Vanderbilt game was a blowout. And because we're sort of coming off of that one, all of a sudden everybody looks and goes, "Oh, well, Florida State must be better." I don't think that's true. I think this is one of those where we're going to find out whether strength of schedule matters. And when it comes to Florida and Florida State, the other thing is these guys all know each other. They hate each other. They're going to be up for it. Yeah. There isn't going to be an excuse of, we didn't get up for this. We weren't ready for it. This was a trap game. Any of that crap. Like, you strap it up, you play this game, you lose, then you're going to hear about it all year long. And for the love of God, Florida win this one so we can stop hearing from the Florida State people.
I don't. You look back at last year, about a year ago. Don't know how much you remember the state of the two programs coming into the Florida State game. Each team was 5-6, but there was very different conversations around both teams. We're fresh off of firing Dan Mullen, and Florida State, I believe they had won. Did they win 4 of 6 coming into that game, or even was it 5? Because they started out like 0 for, right?
It was they were both
5-7.
Yeah, they were both 5-6. They were trying to get.
But did FSU? They had won like 5 of 7 coming into that, right? There was like a good positive momentum coming into that game, and one of the worst Florida teams in the last decade here. You could not take care of them on the home field. So that's why I say the pressure really is on FSU and Norvell to get this done, because you really should get this done if you're Norvell and FSU. And if you don't take care of this, God, that's gonna be a tough look for Florida State.
So here's the deal. Regardless of what happens in this game, and I know I'm going to sound like a homer saying this, but I'm going to say it. I'd rather be in Florida's situation right now than Florida State's. Like, I think Florida has reasonable.
Let me get more than a week away from Vandy before I say that.
Well, no, I'm saying right now, even coming off the loss to Vandy, I'd rather be in Napier's shoes than Norvell's shoes, given all the indicators. Florida's recruiting class is head and shoulders above Florida State's, and this is the 4th recruiting class for Norvell, and it's the 2nd for Napier. So Napier is already recruiting at a higher level than Norvell. This is going to be a one-sided rivalry, much like Florida and Tennessee has been over the past 2 decades, very, very soon, unless Norvell picks it up enormously on the recruiting trail. And look, part of that is winning this game, right? Winning this game should help him in some capacity with some of these local kids. But I think some of it is Florida's got a bigger war chest when it comes to NIL. And Florida, quite frankly, I think has a coach who's a better recruiter. Now, the jury's still out in terms of whether Napier can recruit better than Nick Saban and better than Kirby Smart. And certainly his on-field coaching is going to have to improve in certain aspects as well. But if you ask me today, which situation would I rather be in? I'd pick this one. I'd pick Florida, not Florida State. And so when you talk about there being pressure on Florida State, the only way to reverse that is to win, right? At this point, the recruiting pitch is what it is, right? Like, oh, hey, we improved to 8-3. Isn't that great? Or 8-4. Like you lose this game, it's like we improved to 8-4, but we're still losing to the SEC. It's sort of the recruiting pitch you have. Not all that attractive. I think, the fact that Roderick Kearney already decided to come to Florida instead of Florida State, there's going to be some opportunities for Napier to really drive things home this offseason if they can get this win. So yeah, I mean, if I'm Florida State, this is a must win. If I'm Florida, it's that we already made it to the bowl game. You can't get any worse than a loss from an optics perspective than a loss to Vanderbilt.
No.
And so you're playing with house money. This is one of those where you go
play
in,
loose,
go in,
which I think Florida State, because of that pressure, maybe they come out a little tight. Maybe Norvell coaches a little tight out the gate. Who knows? I think the first quarter, first few drives are going to tell us a lot what's going to happen in this game. And I think if Florida comes out and establishes the run early and we see them have a successful first drive or two, I think that's going to tell us a lot about the direction of the game.
Yeah, man. Look, all I know is Florida plays really well at Ronzook Field. So let's get it done on Friday.
All right. It's a big game with the Noles. Friday night, I believe it's 7:30 p.m. Eastern on ABC or ESPN, one of those two. Disney Family and Networks. Check it out. I'm sure you'll find it. Let's move on to $1 bowl projections for the Gators, plus the playoff picture. We'll start with the Gators, the latest one. This is as of Sunday evening here. Jerry Palm, CBS. He's always the first guy out with all of his bowl projections. He has us in the Las Vegas Bowl against UCLA, who played an absolutely great game with USC last night for those who stayed up and watched it. So tough UCLA team, good matchup there for the Gators. That would actually be a very interesting one. That one, it would be early. Like that's that first bowl weekend, I believe, in December 17th, but that's at the Raiders Stadium. But a couple other projections I saw last week, Gator Bowl versus Clemson, ReliaQuest Bowl versus Iowa, and another Vegas prediction, but for Southern Cal. But I think Southern Cal's entered the playoff conversation. But if you're the Pac-12, you got to do a little better with your bowls there. If it goes from we're playing in the playoffs to we're dropping to the Vegas Bowl immediately. But I think that's either way. That's an interesting matchup going out west playing a Pac-12 school. Either way, that seems to be where we're leaning, Will.
Hey, it's a fun one, right? I mean,
yeah.
at least it's not Shreveport. My brother was joking with me because we were talking about potentially going to Baton Rouge next year, and he joked with me. He's like, when you said Louisiana next year, did you mean Baton Rouge or Shreveport after the loss to Vanderbilt? So look, I mean, we always end up with the Citrus Bowl or the Outback Bowl or the Gator Bowl or whatever those things are called now, but we all know what we're talking about: Jacksonville, Orlando, or Tampa.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be kind of fun to do something different. Go out on the West Coast. It'll be one of those games where it's dark here, but it's light there. It sort of feels weird, almost like the Rose Bowl in some capacity. You're playing UCLA, so you got the famous, powder blue and gold that you're playing against. It's a big time Power 5 opponent. So it's not like you're having to play UCF in a game you don't give a damn about. Like, there's a lot to like about that beyond the fact that you get all the practices and all that sort of stuff. For the players, that's fun, right? I mean, look, a lot of these guys are from Florida. I'm not sure a lot of, I don't know how much they've traveled in their life. I hadn't been to Vegas when I was 18 or 19 years old. So maybe that's a bad thing. Maybe we don't want to go out to Las Vegas, but that's a fun trip for those guys and a fun trip for all the fans, right? So anybody who wants to go along and have a good time for a bowl game has the opportunity to go out in January to Las Vegas.
December.
I'll tell you right now. December. Well,
before Christmas, it would be a pre-Christmas bowl.
Well, whatever. So you get to go out to Vegas and enjoy your time out there. And hey, you can stay through New Year's. You can stay and bet the the playoff if you go out there for a week and a half. And as somebody who lives in Philadelphia, and my face was freezing off today as I was walking outside with my kids, I'm definitely in favor of December trips to Las Vegas. That's for sure.
Yeah, it's freezing down here in Tampa today. It was like 62. I feel like, dude, the windows
Okay.
open all day. All right, let's go to the playoffs here. You look at Georgia's got that number one spot firmly locked up. Ohio State, Michigan at 2-3, and TCU at 4 this past week. But really, the shakeup occurred in Columbia. Tennessee, which was looking real good to jump in at that 4 spot, especially if TCU would drop, which they almost did, kick the last second field goal there. But even if Ohio State and Michigan, they're talking about maybe the loser of that game potentially jumping back in the race there. That's fine. But really, it's looking like this right now. Georgia, if they win out, they're in. Ohio State, Michigan winner. TCU wins out there, and that 4 spot's going to come down to Southern Cal, Ohio State, Michigan loser, Clemson, or if LSU, they have to win to get in. But even if they win, that 2-loss LSU team, are they going to let the 2 losses into the playoffs? Because we haven't seen that yet. Well, so under that scenario, who do you like to get into the playoffs?
I mean, I hope that the 2-loss SEC champion gets in. Whether that knocks the 1-loss Georgia team out, I hope it does, though I don't think anybody will actually knock them out. Look, I think it's going to be Georgia, Ohio State, Michigan, and then either TCU or USC. I think Clemson has an opportunity probably to jump LSU, especially. I mean, obviously, if Georgia beats LSU, then Clemson jumps them. Then it's a question of Clemson, USC, or TCU. TCU has all those close wins, but obviously they've been placed higher. I think when you look at, this was the argument on game day this weekend, is when they beat a bunch of these teams, they were ranked, but now those teams that they've beaten are not necessarily ranked. I think this is going to be one where the committee takes a step back and says, all right, like if we were looking at it like it was college basketball and we were talking about quality wins, a couple of years ago, if Michigan State has a bad year, but you happen to beat them at the start, I think a couple of years ago, Florida, that's probably a great example. Like didn't Florida lose a close game to Duke real early in the college football season, or Gonzaga, and then everybody thought, oh, that's a great win, or a great win for Gonzaga, and then Florida fell apart, and everybody's like, well, not so much. I think that's sort of the same thing. You're going to have to take a holistic look at the overall schedule, and look at who they lost to as well, and sort of make that determination. If TCU's 11-0, I think they make it in. They're not going to keep an undefeated team out. If TCU happens to drop one, then USC has an opportunity. If LSU wins and TCU loses, that's where it gets interesting, because does a 10-2 or an 11-2 at that point SEC champion LSU, who lost to Florida State by a point on a missed extra point, and some other things, you start looking at that and going, well, like these guys really do deserve an extra shot because of where they play and who they play. And that they, at that point, you're kind of punishing LSU for scheduling Florida State to start the year, which is something that I'm not sure the committee's going to want to do, right? Like you lose by 1 point in your opening game, and it wasn't Florida State's opening game either, right? They had played Duquesne before that. So you lose by 1 point early on. I think an argument can be made that LSU's sort of
More of an
work
issue
is
with
better
the
than some of the
40-13 loss to Tennessee than the 1 point loss to Florida State.
Well, I mean, I have an issue with that, but look, I mean, so the SEC has a natural penalty in it because the teams there are just better. And so you get your butt beat whether you're playing Ole Miss or whether you're playing Mississippi State or whether you're playing Auburn. Like you get beat
South
down.
Carolina, Tennessee.
Well, I mean, for Tennessee, yes.
Jeez.
But that's sort of my point, right? Is that any team can get you on any day because these teams are very, very talented, even if they're not as good that particular year. And, you look at like a team like Washington and Oregon are in that 10-12 range. The SEC's got like 5 guys in the top 13. So if you're playing in the SEC, look, you're going to have to play some of those teams, and you might drop one every once in a while. If you're going to penalize them for losing to Tennessee, I think you also have to reward them for taking on Florida State early. And, I think there are, I get it. I understand why USC is going to howl. I think USC will be put in anyway, but it sort of expands the point of why. I mean, the SEC is talking about when they expand that they're just going to have one division. That makes sense, because if you're going to do it this way and you're just going to have your SEC champion be left out of the playoff, then what's the point? Like the game is absolutely meaningless if LSU wins and Georgia goes and LSU doesn't, and if Georgia wins, the game meant nothing. Right? The game meant absolutely nothing if LSU can't get in by winning it. And so that's a real problem for the best conference in the country, considering that, I mean, who you taking if you got USC and LSU neutral field?
Here's my issue with the LSU with the two losses. Even though it's almost unthinkable to think of a scenario where you leave the SEC champ out, but let's say TCU goes unbeaten. Let's say Ohio State runs the table. All right. And so then you get LSU beats Georgia. Are you leaving Georgia out of the playoff at that point?
I mean,
I don't think you. I think Georgia's in already. So in that sense, the game doesn't
well
matter all that much because they showed that last year because they let Georgia in with the one loss. So I think Georgia would fall to the 4 spot on that. Do you put LSU at 3 in that under that scenario? Ohio State 1, TCU 2, LSU and Georgia 4, and then Ohio State. Congratulations, you're the number 1 seed. You get to play Georgia first. That's your reward.
Well, I mean, look, so
or would Georgia take the 3 seed and you put that 2-loss team up against the 1
seed? So I've been very consistent on this ever since they started this whole thing with the playoff, is that I think the champion of the conference, of the best conference in the world, should go regardless. And I think last year when they let Georgia in, and I think 2 years ago, or not 2 years ago, in 2017, when Alabama jumped in on the back end after not going to the SEC championship, I think that sets a bad precedent. I get why the SEC wants 2 teams. I think Alabama was probably the best team that year. But the reality is that if the conference championship means nothing, and if you actually benefit, so the Tennessee loss kind of eliminates this argument. But what that loss, if they had beaten South Carolina, now you're making an argument that it's actually better to miss out on the SEC championship than it is to win it. Because if LSU had beaten Georgia, Georgia and Tennessee would have gone. I'm sitting there going, that makes no sense from the standpoint of, when you set your goals at the beginning of the year, you want to win the SEC West if you're LSU, then you want to win the SEC, then you want to win the playoff. Like, that's sort of the progression that everyone looks at. And you sit there at the start and you go, if we win the SEC, then we will go ahead and go to the national championship. And here's the thing. If LSU had scheduled Eastern Washington instead of Florida State, they would be in position. If they won this game, they go to the playoff. They would. So if you want to incentivize these teams to play that opening Chick-fil-A game where they're playing somebody who's good and all that sort of crap, like, you cannot penalize LSU for losing to Florida State by a point if they go through and win the toughest conference. And I'm sorry, that's just the way it is. And you're like, I guarantee you that the incentive structure is set up to never have a hard non-conference game. If you're going to have to go through the SEC, and if you win the conference with a loss in a non-conference game and that knocks you out, like, there's just no incentive to have a hard non-conference game in that capacity. And I'm sorry that it's going to leave out USC, or I'm sorry it's going to leave out, a 1-loss Michigan, or I'm sorry that TCU might get bumped, or whatever the hell they end up doing. I'm sorry for Georgia, right? But you just lost. Like, you just lost to this team.
I think you got to punish that second loss, Will. I don't know. It's not. You keep talking about the Florida State loss. I got more of an issue with the 40-13 loss to Tennessee. That's more my. I mean, LSU's had incredible second half of the season. I'm with you. I can't even believe these words are coming out of my mouth. That I'm even thinking about the SEC champ not being in the playoff. But
will you be consistent then? If LSU beats Georgia 40-12, is Georgia out? Because then it's the exact same resume.
It's their first loss too. I
know, but if you're telling me
Georgia played Oregon that first game, and they kicked their ass, dude.
Oh, I know. Look, I don't think LSU is going to win this game. So
I don't either. That's why I think it's not really a discussion
argument whatsoever. but I think you're now getting to the crux of why I hate the 12-game playoff. The reason that I hate
the 12-team playoff.
Yeah. The reason that I hate the 12-team playoff is that this will be the crap we're arguing over. We're going to be sitting there going, like, they're going to have to completely reorganize what they do. Because if I look at it and I go, well, the SEC champion is going to be like, Georgia literally could just play whoever Stetson Bennett's backup is. Who is it? Carson Beck. Like, just go play Carson Beck, your 3 backup offensive linemen, and treat it like a spring game. Because it doesn't freaking matter. And it should be the crown jewel of the conference, and it doesn't matter. That's a problem. And, you can talk about like the BCS, and you can talk about when they had like cross-national or, shared national titles and all that sort of stuff. But at least all the games up until that point mattered, right? Like the SEC championship game mattered, even if you weren't necessarily going to get back into the Rose Bowl, or even if the Rose Bowl was going to screw it up. So where, Washington State was playing Ohio State, you had Florida playing Florida State, or I guess it was Arizona State and Michigan that were playing the year that I can't remember what the hell was happening that year.
What, 96?
Yeah.
Florida State in the Sugar, Ohio State, Arizona State in the Rose.
Yeah. So look, I get it. Like, I understand that was non-ideal too, but at least the SEC championship game mattered. Right now, the SEC championship game doesn't even matter.
So we agree on that point. We do agree on that point. I do think that the precedent I keep going back to, though, is that Penn State team with Saquon in 2016, where they beat Ohio State head to head. They won the Big Ten, and they still put Ohio State in over Penn State that year. Yeah, with a one-loss Ohio State team that didn't win their conference and lost head to head to the team they were arguing with to go, and they'd still put the Buckeyes in over Penn State that year because of the second loss. And that's what I don't think LSU is a guarantee to get in. However, I do think that it does help that Clemson, I don't think a lot of people are sold on Clemson as a playoff team this year. It seems to have a pretty weak resume overall. But Southern Cal, though, if they win out, they're in. They're in if LSU takes out Georgia. I think there's a way Southern Cal gets in that could complicate things too.
Well,
so
look, I mean, I'm rooting for chaos. So and I'm obviously rooting against Georgia,
right?
Though having to hear Brian Kelly's Southern accent after an SEC championship, maybe
give me your odds
my ears
that LSU beats Georgia. Give me a percentage chance of LSU beating Georgia. Are you under 20 like me? I'm like at about 15.
I think it's higher than that. I think there's a distinct possibility that Harold Perkins is just going to terrorize Stetson Bennett. And the Bennett looked terrible against Florida. And what's he going to do against a team that has a guy like Perkins rushing the passer? I mean, I would put it like 30. I'd say it's like 70-30. I think Georgia's a better team. I think LSU has a real shot. A couple of turnovers from Bennett. You're not just gonna Florida's not just gonna piss them away, or LSU's not just gonna piss them away like Florida does. And that it was 28-3 at the end of the first half against Florida, and Florida came out in the second half and really sort of dominated that game. There have been stretches where Georgia has looked mortal, and I think there's an opportunity where Georgia might look mortal in this game, especially because it doesn't matter. Right? Like, why do you get up for a game that you just don't care? Like, I guess the only thing that it matters it matters for me because then we can call him the SEC runner-up again next year in our preview magazine. But other than that, like, Kirby, it doesn't matter.
With the SEC.
It doesn't matter. So I mean, it's just so disappointing. Like, growing up and going through the Urban Meyer years and all that stuff, this was the beacon that if you won this, you were going places. And now it doesn't matter, and that's sad. I just, I get it. Well, I understand.
There just needs to be some sort of restructure there because it's like the bowl games. It's like people want to complain about the players sitting out of the bowl games, but why do they do it?
Yeah,
it doesn't matter.
But what's the restructure in this place? Who plays Georgia in a championship game if you restructure? I mean, LSU's the second best team in the conference.
Yeah.
I guess you'd say,
playing for home field, does it guarantee home field for a certain round? It's got to have some attachment to the next step. Like, you said,
this is gonna be like the Colts, like the Bills. What was it years ago? The year of the Music City Miracle, because I'm a Bills fan and I'm a masochist. So they end up, Doug Flutie starts the first 16 games of the year, and then in week 17, when it means nothing, they start Rob Johnson, and he plays well against the Colts in a game that means nothing, and they're like, well, we're gonna start him against the Titans next week. Like, everybody remembers the Music City Miracle. They don't remember that Doug Johnson was the quarterback instead of Doug Flutie in that game against the Titans. And I mean, is that what we're heading towards? Like week 17 in the NFL? Well, week 18 now in the NFL. We're just, nobody gives a damn. And that's just really a shame.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think we got to come up with something to enhance the meeting where you can
send LSU and kick Georgia's ass out.
Yeah. Okay. If you give me, I'd vote for it. I'd be with you.
I wanted it last year too, buddy.
Don't get me wrong. We'll see. All right. One last thought too. Hendon Hooker ACL tear. Right. We saw that news today. That's terrible, man. That offense was a blast to watch this year. I'm not happy that it was Tennessee having all that success, but I mean, anyone, if you're just a general college football fan, watching that offense go up and down the field, Hooker ran that thing to perfection. And man, the dream came crashing down pretty hard. It's aside from the injury, obviously, which is terrible. But I mean, that South Carolina offense was just cooking in Williams-Brice on Saturday night. Will
Yeah,
nobody saw that coming. That was crazy.
So there are a couple things here. Obviously, I've talked before. I'm actually wearing it tonight. I went to Virginia Tech for grad school. My dad grew up in Blacksburg, so I've got pretty decent ties to the Hokies. And so I'd followed Hendon Hooker when he was there at Virginia Tech. He's a really good quarterback. In fact, him transferring is probably what wound up costing Justin Fuente the job there. Look, he was good when he was there. He's been great at Tennessee ever since he got there. I think Florida would have probably lost Tennessee last year if they'd have started Hooker earlier in the year. Instead, they started Joe Milton, and then Hooker took over in the game against Florida because Milton was hurt, and then sort of played inconsistently in that one, and then was lights out ever since. A real Heisman Trophy candidate this year. I don't think he was quite good enough, especially after the performance against Georgia, to be a Heisman Trophy candidate, but certainly the excitement there in Knoxville this year is something that you can't deny that he's been able to bring there, and Heupel's offense and all that sort of stuff. I think though, and this is one of the things. So from the standpoint of like Hooker, you just feel terrible because a quarterback who was probably like a mid-level NFL prospect. He was not going to be like some high-level prospect. He was probably going to get an opportunity to be drafted, but he wasn't going to be a high draft pick. You wonder now with the injury, is he going to have the ability to do that? And so you ache for that because anytime a guy gets hurt in a college football game, you just sit there and go, he had some earning potential. Did that go away? And that really sucks if that's the case. Beyond that, so Tennessee got beat in this game way before Hooker got hurt. Obviously, the injury, he fumbled the ball on the injury, and South Carolina rubbed it in and put a couple more touchdowns in, but that game was over by the time he had the injury. So, this isn't something where he got injured and it cost Tennessee a playoff spot. It's the playoff spot was gone before he got injured. And it did start getting me thinking about sort of Tennessee and the state of their program. And I think one of the interesting things to look at is this seems a lot like the 2020 Florida team where, that LSU loss where the defense just couldn't stop LSU, even though LSU was terrible. And Florida, because of, look, I mean, we talk about talent, we talk about recruiting. I really do think, and I think if you look at the numbers, it bears this out, that it doesn't prevent you from having an elite team, but what it does is it means that when you have one of those days where you go out and just things are off, you can't recover. And you think about the Missouri game that Georgia was able to pull out this year. I mean, that was just one where they were able to stop Missouri in the red zone so many times to give their offense a little bit of time to wake up. And this game against South Carolina, Tennessee's defense just could not come up with a stop. And even when the offense was humming up and down the field for the Vols, it felt like they had to keep scoring because there was no way the defense was going to stop on the other side of the ball. And certainly we've had a couple of those games like that this year at Florida. So we know what that feels like. But the point is that when you think about that 2020 team for Florida, that was one where Kyle Trask elevated everyone to a level where, can you imagine what would have happened with that 2020 team and that defense had Trask not been the quarterback? Like if it had been Emory Jones at quarterback in 2020, what would the record have been? And
Yeah,
would it have been
a lot like 2021?
Like 2021. And so, look, I've looked at Joe Milton's high school stats. I've looked at his college stats so far. And if he's the starting quarterback for Tennessee next year, this team's going to take a major step back. And the recruiting at Tennessee has not been high enough under Heupel to, it's sort of the same thing with Norvell, right? Like this is the time. This was the time. And every once in a while you can get to that height, but it's really hard to sustain it when you're recruiting at the level that Heupel is. And so it's going to be really interesting to see over the next 4 or 5 years, what happens at Tennessee. Do they sort of cycle around like an Auburn where, hey, they'll have a bunch of years where they're 8-5 and every once in a while they'll be 11-1 or maybe even pull out a 12-0 or go 10-2, or is it going to be something where the bottom falls out and then the fan base gets upset and changes have to be made and all that sort of stuff? And we'll see, because this felt an awful lot to me like the 2020 team. And, that 2020 team going to the bowl game, basically everybody left and you had Trask throwing to receivers he hadn't thrown to all year and things just fell apart against Oklahoma. I'm going to be really interested to see what happens next week against Vanderbilt for Tennessee with Milton starting, and then the bowl game that they play in, and whether guys basically check out on this season at this point. Does it just sort of mimic that 2020 year, and is 2023 for Tennessee going to kind of be a nightmare like 2021 was for Florida?
You imagine the Vandy hype train if they knock off Tennessee this weekend?
Hey, bowl eligibility, man.
Whew, the Vandy hype train headed into 2023 would be strong. That would actually be pretty interesting to
You and
see.
I have
I
been
wouldn't
singing their
mind it.
praises for months now. So
Yeah, unfortunately. Well, hey, it goes to show you. Look, Carolina when they were in the swamp a couple weeks ago didn't look so pretty on top of the world. To after beating Tennessee, college football can go up and down. So for those of you who are feeling very down about the Vanderbilt loss, like you should, like I am, like you are, Will, it just goes to show you college football is a crazy sport and it could flip around pretty quickly. So let's hope the Gators flip it around. Going up to Tallahassee this Friday night against the Seminoles. Those of you out there, thank you for the support. Happy Thanksgiving. Have a great week. Sure, there'll be a lot of road trips that we're being listened to on here, Will. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. And Will, I'll give you the final word before we head out.
yeah, just really, this goes fast, right? We got one game left of the regular season, one
Crazy.
bowl game. Enjoy it. So we've enjoyed being here all year long. Appreciate everybody supporting us. Again, if you've missed it, we're doing post-game instant analysis over on Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/reading reaction. There's also a Wednesday article that I put up over there that's exclusive to the Patreon subscribers. We're going to be doing stuff during the off season over there as well. Hopefully rewarding people who've been supporting us. And certainly the preseason magazine is going to be here sooner than any of us can imagine. And so if you want to get access to that and maybe some early snippets from that, we'll probably be posting some stuff over there as well. So again, if you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. That helps us out. Go over to the website, subscribe over there. It's free. If all you do is support us in the free entities, that's great. We appreciate it. But if you want to do a little bit more, if you like what we do, head over to Patreon. Help us out.
Thank you for watching this episode of Stand Up and Holler. Be sure to subscribe to the Read and Reaction YouTube channel. Join our Patreon community at Read and Reaction for bonus content each week. And check out our website at readandreaction.com. I'm Nick Knudsen, joined by Will Miles, and as always, go Gators.